Well, there's a lot of great energy in the room. There must be a lot of things that bring you joy, which is fantastic. So let me, as I rudely interrupt you, ask you to just push pause on that conversation and revisit that over lunch and over other conversations you're having with folks. And an important thing to do to continue to talk about those things and remember those things that bring you joy. Anybody nice and loud so everybody can hear? What were the kinds of things talked about in your little holy huddle or your table? What are some of the things that bring us joy in ministry? Anybody?
Where God wants you.
It's where God wants you. That sense of deep peace that Dee was talking about last night, of knowing you are right where God wants you to be. And there's no substitute for that. Absolutely. What else?
You want spiritual growth in your congregation.
To watch spiritual growth in other people. Absolutely. And sometimes there's that overwhelming sense that, wow, God actually used some of my gifts and some of my hard work to accomplish that. And then there are those times when we just get to have a front row seat to something that really was about God and maybe even happened in spite of us. I don't know if you've ever had those moments in ministry. I know I have. But yeah, other folks. What else? Yes?
A second chance to answer God's call on me for the ministry.
Wow, a second chance to answer God's call. Yeah. Thankfully, God is gracious in second and third and fourth and many chances. Amen. Other things. What about the tasks? What about the things that a pastor has to do day in and day out? Yeah.
We didn't bring it up in our conversation, but we do visitation every Tuesday. And we are more blessed by than the people that we're visiting are blessed by our visit. When we leave, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And that ministry is just flourishing now because of the talk that's coming back from it, from the church, people who are involved in it.
Wow.
That we started with 2, now we're up to about 12 on Tuesday afternoons.
Wow. And if you couldn't hear the back, he's talking about visitation ministry. So that's hospitals, shut-ins, nursing homes, all the above. Yeah.
Friends of people, just the church, just whoever.
Yeah. And isn't it amazing? And sometimes folks, particularly who aren't pastors, who aren't people of faith, don't understand how it is you could go into places of suffering, like hospitals or nursing homes, and actually experience joy. It seems counterintuitive or paradoxical or something, but there's something about that particularly if you are more wired in a pastoral care kind of way, that is just a wonderful and what an incredible ministry to folks to show up and pray with folks and bless them.
One of the things we started to do is we were going into rooms and the person we would pray for the person we were visiting, and we were walking out, and the person in the same room next to him would kind of look at us. So we started to stop and ask, can we pray for you?
Wow.
And that's really,
Yeah.
that's help our people grow to at least ask that question.
Some ministry of the other patients and so forth. Yeah. But just makes me think of the story. Pastor Reed, who I was mentioning before, visited my grandmother, my dad's mom, who had Alzheimer's about the last 8 years of her life and increasingly, degenerated and so forth. And he loved to tell the story when he came in to visit her one day. And she had been to charm school as a girl and was very proper and so forth. And she said to him, "Oh, won't you have a seat?" And she gestured to the porta potty that was right next to her bed there. And he just got a huge kick out of that. And she would have been mortified if she'd actually known what she had done. But he loved to tell that story. So some funny things happen at visitation. Yeah, I mean, if you go into the room at the wrong time, you may get more than you bargained for. That's for sure. But yeah. What else? Other things that come to mind? 2 or 3 more. Yes, back here.
I get joy out of pouring my life into my congregation through my preaching.
Yes.
That I have the privilege of studying for 20 hours a week.
Yes.
So that I can, because, I don't know what my congregation is going through on a daily basis all the time. And so just to see, like when they come up to you afterwards and go, wow, I needed to hear that, and I may have no clue.
Yeah, that's right.
And so just to be able to pour my life and experience and my education into these people's lives, and whether they get anything from it or not, just the opportunity that God is letting me do that brings me just the
well said. Well said. Absolutely. Yeah. The privilege of as part of your work week, getting able to spend time and study in Scripture and theology, and then to know. And who loves to preach, by the way? Just show of hands. Yeah, we got some preachers out there. Right on. To know that the Holy Spirit has led you in that preparation process in ways that you didn't even realize, and that in that mystery of preaching that happens, that it connected with somebody, and word of God happened, and they walked away with a moment of opportunity to live differently and be inspired, and you've given them hope, or God has given them hope through your discipline, preparation. Incredible feeling. Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. I saw another hand back here at the same table or behind. Yes?
There are festivals together with this congregation. That's lots of fun. It also is a festival.
Absolutely. So celebration with the community. Absolutely. Fantastic.
Watch the body grow with the body.
What's that?
To watch the body grow with the body.
To watch the body grow the body. Absolutely. Watch the church build itself up in love. You bet. Lots of things we could point to about the joys in ministry. And so I really do want to encourage you to continue to think about those things. And in particular, what breathes the most life into you? And we'll talk about why that's important a little bit later. But what are the greatest joys that you've had so far? What are the things that you most look forward to? Now, there's parts of any job that just have to get done, right? And it may not be in your sweet spot. But I want you to reflect on what brings you joy, because that's a hugely important piece. Now, apparently, so I hear, there's also stress in ministry. It's a rumor. And even if you haven't yet been the lead pastor at a church, you've been around church long enough or had enough ministry responsibility to have experienced some of that in some way. So maybe gather up again with the same folks and talk about what's stressful, either in your own experience or what you've heard or read about pastoral life. Talk about some of the stresses and the challenges that come. I'm going to need to interrupt you again. And there seems to be at least as much energy in the room talking about stress as the joy. But that's actually what we find bearing out increasingly in research of pastors, is that at the same time, it's the best of all possible callings, and in some ways the hardest of all possible job descriptions. That the joy is certainly there. It's a high joy and high stress simultaneously calling and vocational journey. And so we want to talk about the implications of that and what might that mean. But what are some of the things that came up in your conversations or that you're thinking about when you think of ministry stress? What comes to mind? Yes?
I'm new at the whole administration thing.
Uh-huh.
And my church board knows this. And so it's very stressful when they just try to go over my head. And I'm trying to say, slow down. Like, for instance, we need a new church roof. And one guy said, well, I'll loan you the money. And I don't know much, but I do know in the manual it says you just can't loan that money, about $32,000.
Yeah.
So I told them, let's slow down. And they got really mad at me. They got a heated. I thought I was going to lose my job.
Wow.
And
Over the roof. Yeah. Over the church roof.
Yeah. And so it's learning how to do that, because you have classes, but it's a different thing because you're always sitting on the board. You're not the guy in charge. And when you're now the chairman overseeing it, it's a whole nother ball.
Sure.
And so for me, it's stressful learning and catching up and learning how this goes, because a lot of people, they've done this for 30 years.
Yeah.
I've not.
Yeah.
And so it's getting into the mode of doing that, and to me, that's really, really stressful.
And so thank you for that. There's several important things I hear you saying. One of those is conflict, right? How do you know, which apparently happens in churches at times. In fact, do any of you know the name Harold Ivan Smith by any chance? He's a Nazarene brother that's been around a long time. He loves to say that he loves to go to General Assembly, Nazarene General Assembly, and just walk up to random Nazarene people and just say, how'd that thing work out at your church? And just see what comes out. He said, you'll hear all kinds of stuff. Because everybody's got something, going on at their church. But yeah, navigating with board members who can be difficult, the administrative load, particularly if that wasn't, you're not equipped for that by seminary or whatever training you've had. Challenging stuff. The complexity, the role complexity is what psychologists call that. So many different hats that you have to wear, so many different areas of competency. It would be nice to know about roofing, but that wasn't covered in the course of study somehow or something. So yeah, absolutely. What else? What else is stressful? Busyness. Yes. which in our culture equals importance, right? The busier you are, you must be more important. And we get sucked into that. But absolutely, the busyness, the juggling, the time stress, way more to do than what you have time to do. And for pastors, it's often, time stress is tied to the relational stress sometimes. So the last 8 years or so of my life, I've been in a campus pastor role, and sort of the joke we had around the office is, who are we going to disappoint this week? Because we'd always have all kinds of requests, wonderful requests to be at events or, whatever the group is that wanted to have a pastoral presence, and you just can't do everything and be everywhere. It'd be nice to be. And anytime you say no, there are going to be potential relational consequences for that no, right? And so how do you make those choices and kind of navigate that unrelenting sort of time and relational stress? What else? Yes?
Stubborn people.
Stubborn people. You talking about this group, or are you talking about the people in... Oh, okay. Yeah. Isn't it interesting that the greatest joys often have to do with people, but the greatest stresses also have to do with what? With people. Anytime you're doing something with people, they're going to bring all the complexities and brokenness and mystery and challenges that come with that, and we bring our own into that as well. So absolutely, it's the interpersonal stress that we want to focus on here for just a bit. A couple more. What else?
Being God's temple, physically fit. Without, it's already been mentioned about, your longevity is being shortened in some cases.
That's right.
Because of health reasons, diet, whatever.
You bet. Just the challenges of being physically fit because of the demands on your time and more of a sedentary job in some ways. Sure, absolutely. Thank you. One or two more. Priorities? Yeah. How do you know?
Put food on the table.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yep. And people don't consult with you, your calendar, before they have a crisis, do they? So you got your week planned out, and lo and behold, somebody passes away, or there's an accident in the middle of the night. And you'll hear me say this in different ways. I believe in Christian counseling and Christian therapists. Therapy is a wonderful thing. But who do church people go to first before they go to the Christian therapist? They go to you. You're the one there in the middle of the night when somebody's been killed by a drunk driver at the hospital. You're the one there in the trauma and the crisis when there's a decision that's made that a marriage is going to end. You grieve uniquely with people about those sorts of things. No other helping professional, as great as physicians and family therapists and social work, all the other helping professions are, and needed they are, nobody is in the lives of people like you are. And I think nobody can quite have the impact that you can have as well. But that does come with some implications. It's really great to have Rebecca here. I've for years done this seminar by myself and was really thrilled to invite her into this because she not only has experience as a woman in ministry, and I think there's some additional considerations there, but also your husband's been in ministry, so you've also been a ministry leader yourself and the spouse of a pastor. I'm convinced that it's in some ways more difficult to be the spouse of a pastor than even to be the pastor. And so maybe you could get us talking just for a second about those two pieces, and we'd love to hear from some of you who are women in leadership and spouses, whether you're male or female spouse here, about the unique stresses that come with that as well.
I'm going to prime the pump a little bit. Did some reading, just trying to get my head around sort of what are the stressors and the particular realities for both women in ministerial leadership and for spouses, male or female, ministry leaders. And just listen to these voices. This comes from an article on models of clergy spouses in Protestant churches. I read wacky stuff like this. These are just voices. This is a male clergy spouse. In some cases, I see some things that aren't being done and I just do them. If somebody ain't going to do it, it needs to be done, it gets done. So that's what I mean when I say what boundaries. This is a clergy wife, a pastor's wife. I feel as for me in my role as a pastor's wife, my priority is to be a support to him. And so when the kids were little and stuff like that, I mean, my goals were just to manage the house. I still had to work, but just kind of manage the house. if I could do that and make sure he had a meal when he was supposed to have a meal, then I was doing as much for the church as I could in keeping the kids under control. That was all I could do for the church. Another pastor's wife. I'll do whatever I need to do. I'm now on the decorating committee, and I've been doing stuff there. So, I'm very happy to be involved, but I also realize I have to be involved deliberately in very key things that I kind of can do quickly and well. And then I got to pull back and focus, because my work is really what I've got to focus on too, because I've got to make money to benefit the church. I can't just do supper after supper after supper. And one last one. If activities needed an extra body, I was pretty much always there. Fortunately, that's changed a lot now because there's more of a critical mass. Before, there's the skating party. You got to go, or no one else will be there. There'll be no chaperone. There's the men's group, so you go to the men's group. There's a retreat now, but I don't want to go to the retreat, but I go to the retreat.
Yeah.
Do you recognize those people? Some of you who are in clergy spouse roles, pastor's wife, or any of the women clergy in the room, if you're married, a clergy husband, people who are in either those supportive roles, or I would say for the women clergy, I also just want to say, I know that you're like 1 of 49 on your district, or there's 4 of you and there's 60 males. That's a different reality. So, what are some of the stresses that you resonated with in either what I said or things that might come up if you are in one of those other non-majority roles?
I think that our time isn't always our time. We may work out of the house and then we come home and then we're involved in the church, so it's to support our husband or things that we're involved in, and so it's, we don't have a lot of free time.
Yeah, so time doesn't ever feel like there's either enough of it or you can really make too many decisions around it? Yeah.
A balance of that, too. What is the balance to what has to be done, per se, outside the church for your family, and what is the timeline that needs to be done for the church in the church role as well?
How do you balance those competing priorities?
Yeah.
Being pigeonholed. So
Okay.
you're a mom, so you obviously should be working with children's ministries, or you're a woman, so lead women's ministries. And I'm going, but I don't really, like my strengths don't fit those roles, and I'm forced to do them because I'm there, and no one else will do them. So I have to, or it doesn't get done.
You're supposed to play the piano too, right? It's,
I don't
yeah, okay.
But I mean, for me, if I don't do children's ministry, then my children don't get ministered to.
So there's assumption that gender has some natural giftedness in certain areas when
And then
that may not be who you are.
And knowing that that's hurting the church, because I am the most vocal person in our very small congregation, so you've put me in the back. And so there's no one that's willing to visibly worship. There's no one willing, and so we're hurting because I've been.
And I hear underneath that a desire to say, I wish you asked me what I feel called and gifted to do. Yeah, I hear that. What else? What else? Do we have any male clergy spouses here? Anything particular about being you?
Well, yeah, I think that she's, we were talking, and being an administrative pastor, she has to deal with like facilities and fixing toilets, fixing a water main that's broken. And sometimes it's easier for her just to call me versus trying to find someone else that can do it. So it's like, I get to my job and then go right over to the church and start digging a hole through the water main.
You shouldn't be gifted in that way.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can call because it's like, why am I always doing this?
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
double duty thing comes out in a
Sure.
variety of ways, and sort of the gender expectations too. Yeah, it doesn't go just one way, that's true. Anybody else?
I'd say there isn't much of a role model. I'm not gonna do the keys and the, singing or playing a caption. I don't do any of those things. So what are the roles?
Where do you have a role model? What do you do? If there's a traditional role of what a clergy spouse is, and you're
No.
not that.
And I'm not a woman.
You're
and I
not
don't,
female, you're not gonna move into those natural
So,
sort of stereotypes.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's difficult. It's difficult to be a woman in ministry. I can say for myself, until I had some strong role models, I didn't know I could do this thing. I really needed to see others. I think for anyone in a role where you don't look around and see very many people who either look like you or sound like you or sort of walked in the same way, it's a tough thing. There's a lot of sort of internal work that takes place as to who am I and where do I fit into this? Yeah, and that's just a human thing.
Sure. One of the things that we know about those role models and ministry mentors is the way one author puts it, that holds out before us a possible self. In other words, we start to identify with something that we see in that person, and it gives us a sense of hope that it might be possible for me to fulfill that role in a particular kind of way. And I think what I would say to everybody, both pastors and spouses in the room, out of my clinical experience and also my own pastoral experience, we tend to, certainly there's no shortage of expectations from other people about what you should be doing and how you should be doing it. And people feel endless permission to vocalize that, right? So we'll talk about how to deal with that. But it's also the expectations we have for ourselves that actually are sometimes more difficult to contend with than the external expectations. And so what I would want to invite you to do, pastor or pastor's spouse, is not put pressure on yourself to fit some sort of stereotypical role. For me, it's Pastor Reed. I had to contend. He's such the paradigm, but I'm not him. And so you're going to fulfill the role of pastor or the role of spouse of pastor very uniquely because of who God has made you to be. And so we want to help you find ways to give yourself permission to be yourself, whether your church gives you that permission or not. I hope they do. But to be yourself, and you fill those roles the way that you fill those roles out of your strengths and gifts and calling. And sometimes the church, I think you mentioned this, Rebecca, was a helpful insight to me. Maybe I'll ask you to expand on it for just a second. For both pastors, but also pastor's spouse, which is often more the hidden, unspoken expectation, the paradigm is whoever the previous pastor's spouse was and how they filled that role. And then you get compared. And can you talk about how to navigate that a little bit and deal with that?
It's one of the things that researchers also look at and ask people. And often if there was a long-term pastor before you, and their spouse, if they were married, had a very particular place in the church, who did all the teas or the luncheons or whatever, whoever the next pastor is, their spouse will inherit that expectation. And it'll be, that's just sort of a role, a social role that there's a lot of expectation around. And often the best way you can navigate that is to name it. Name it. Talk about it. You have to put it out there and say, I know so-and-so, this is what they did, and what a wonderful role for that. But then claiming sort of, this is what I feel God has called me to do, or this is what I'm good at. And sometimes you just have to navigate that and name the expectation. And most of the studies and people I've talked to say that over time, if churches, that usually happens when someone's been there for a very long time, and the family, the church family, has it sort of like, you know, the role of the mama is changed, or the role of the daddy is changed. So you have a whole family dynamic, and it's not unlike when somebody remarries or something else. You have to re-navigate the roles, but you have to do so with some conscious conversation around it. Those expectations tend to be lower if there's been a shorter pastorates or more variety in how pastor and family engaged with the church. One of the things just that there seems to be three ways that clergy spouses involve in church. One is to say, I am a partner in ministry. We do this thing together. I'm as called as my partner is. Anything that needs to be done, I will do. That's one model. The other model is one of supportive. I'll go to the church, I'll find my place of ministry, I'll do this one thing. When I was in active ministry as one of the pastors of a large church, my husband was more in this model, in that he said, I'll do mission trips, I'll lead mission trips. So there was that one thing that he did. And so he found a place of active ministry, but it wasn't whatever needs to be done. And then the third is a very independent model, which saying that's your church, that's your occupation. I'll come when it's expected, or it's a formal dinner or that thing, but don't expect me to fill in all the blanks. And those three models show up in every denomination, and it really has to do with the individual. Certain denominations have sort of a more cultural affinity to one of those models. But I hope it gives you freedom to know that you can be you. God designed you as you, not to be somebody that you're not, and that we mostly flourish in ministry when we're working out of that core sense of who we are in God.
Great stuff. Absolutely. Thank you. So let's move into, I just want to share with you some research, and I hope this doesn't feel too academic like you're back in school at Point Loma or something. But I think it can be helpful to give some perspective, and you can kind of gauge maybe where you might fall in comparison in some of these. I want to talk first of all, so I'm going to skip a couple slides here. Part of why we're talking about this, and by the way, you're going to get an email with slides, so you don't feel like you have to take all of this down, because you'll get a copy of these and our slides this afternoon as well. Part of why we involve spouses in this weekend, and we do the marital satisfaction inventory that you filled out as a couple, because of the issues we've just been talking about. Ministry leadership has implications for a marriage unlike any other role that a person can have. And so we want to encourage the strengthening of that marriage and clarity between spouses about how you're going to approach those roles together. That's probably the most important thing, and then certainly having that conversation with your congregation as well. Because there are going to be stress and expectations placed on your marriage that are unique. And so we want to help strengthen that. And I put this up here, the quote at the bottom, the sentence at the bottom is from a mentor and friend of mine, Dr. Arch Hart, who's a professor at Fuller Seminary for many years and was one of the first folks to really study ministry stress and study pastors. And he has been a part of putting back together the lives of many pastors who've engaged in misconduct of various kinds because they didn't pay attention to all the stuff we're talking about today. And this is his quote that I love, that pastors don't get into trouble because they forget that they're pastors. We get into trouble because we forget that we're persons.
Somebody needs to tell our congregation that.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll talk about why it is that people have trouble seeing you as a person, but that comes with inherent limitations, right? The fact that you're a person. You need to sleep eventually. We are sexual beings as persons, even if you're a pastor. And we have to think about that, contend with that. What does that mean? What does it mean to have healthy sexuality just as a Christian? And then what are the implications in a leadership role? We're going to talk more about that this afternoon. What are the implications of just being a person, giving yourself permission to be that, and allow God to help you be yourself? Variety of studies. I'm just going to throw some stats at you just to give you a sense of what we know about pastors. Again, not to discourage you from moving forward in the ordination process, because again, most of what I'm about to show you can be prevented. It truly can. 25% of all current pastors have been traumatized at some point by a dysfunctional congregation. At least 38% feel totally frustrated, not just partially frustrated by their work. 3 out of 5 are burned out by the 10th year of ministry. There seems to be a 10-year wall of sort of compassion fatigue. This shows up with relief and development workers and missionaries as well, but pastors. It's not going to be up here, but another stat that has shown up multiple times in different studies, half the people in this room will not be in ministry 5 years from today. We don't want that to happen. Now, part of that can be what's called job shock, which is even though somebody told me it was stressful, once I actually experience myself full-time in the role with the burden of command, like we were hearing about earlier, it's way more stressful. It's different than I thought it was going to be. I'm out. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to sell real estate or whatever it is. I just can't do this anymore. So there's a 5-year kind of wall and a 10-year wall. 25% of pastors have been forced out or fired from their ministry at least once. I'm included in that statistic. 90% feel inadequately trained. 90% feel inadequately trained to cope with the demands of ministry. Now, I think that has a lot to do with the job complexity. It's why it's so hard to be in a role like Rebecca is in, and Ron Benefield is here, like Ron has been in various capacities. How do you train somebody for ministry in 4 years of college and 2 or 3 years of an MDiv? What do you include in the curriculum? Right? It's really challenging to fit everything in that it would be nice to fit in. And so we want to be lifelong learners as well. 80% believe that pastoral ministry has negatively impacted their family. 45% say they've experienced depression or burnout to the extent they needed to take a leave of absence. You feeling good about your career choice right about now? Okay, good. 40% have serious conflict with a church member at least once per month. That always gets a little bit of a chuckle. Somebody will say, well, is that all? That doesn't seem very often. 20% admit to having an affair. Admit to having an affair while in the ministry, which would suggest it's actually higher than that. The rate of sexual misconduct for clergy is higher than any other helping profession, higher than doctors, therapists, lawyers. We'll talk about why that might be the case. 37% admit that internet pornography is a current struggle. You may have heard on the news the controversy or the scandal with the website, the Ashley Madison website. That apparently, if you want to have an affair, you go onto this website and they'll connect you with somebody else who wants to have an affair. And it came out that there were 400 Southern Baptist pastors who'd been using that website, whose names were released when the list got hacked. That's just one denomination. I wonder how many pastors are on that list. Why is that? What's going on here? We need to think about this together. And then this one, if you don't hear me say anything else today at all, I want you to hear this one. 70% of pastors do not currently in their life, other than their spouse, have someone in their life they consider a close friend. There's something about ministry leadership, particularly congregational leadership, that is inherently isolating. The role is psychologically isolating, it's socially isolating, and people just wouldn't assume that's the case because you're around people all the time. How could you be isolated? But it has a lot to do with how people relate to you, which I'll talk about in a moment. This slide was a study done across a lot of different denominations that were the top reasons why pastors left ministry prematurely. And you'll see it when you get the PowerPoint. It's probably too small to read. Most of the reasons are relational. That's what I want you to take away from that. That it has to do with things like conflict, burnout, allegations of sexual misconduct, family problems. Those tend to be the things that lead to people leaving ministry prematurely. So let's talk about stress for just a second. What is stress? It's being extended beyond our limits without time for recovery. We were actually designed for the period in history when we did camel travel. We weren't designed in terms of our physiology and how our bodies are made to fly across the country in 5 hours while texting and watching a movie and doing 6 other things that are constantly overstimulating our brain. We live at a pace in developed countries in the world that is beyond what we were designed to live. In fact, there are a group of folks called psychoneuroimmunologists that study the impact of the pace of life in developed countries on the immune system of societies. And what they're suggesting is we're actually compromising the immune system of the human race, because one of the things stress does is it weakens your immune system, because we're living at too fast of a pace without pacing ourselves and taking a break and resting. And we're over arousing our adrenal system. Ministry is an adrenaline demanding profession. Just to meet the demands of the job, all the stresses we've talked about, the unrelenting interpersonal stress, the unpredictability of schedule. Without realizing it, unconsciously or subconsciously, pastors are constantly taxing our stress hormones just to meet the demands of the job. I talked with an executive pastor from a very large church in Southern California who was actually here at Masters of Ministry course several years ago at Point Loma. And I was sharing some of this similar information. He came up afterward. He said, please share my story. I was actually hospitalized for adrenal failure because I didn't pay attention to taking care of myself. And my body finally said, I'm not making any more adrenaline or cortisol or the other 37 plus stress hormones for you. And that has some pretty serious implications. Apparently, major organ systems start to shut down, those kinds of things. So he was hospitalized for a month and then came back to work about 6 months later and has very different boundaries around his time and self-care, and has thankfully been able to reverse a lot of that damage. But there will be implications if you don't pay attention to this. A certain amount of stress is helpful for a short period of time. It helps us excel and perform well. If you think of those of you that love to preach, you kind of get psyched up to preach, right? And the adrenaline while you're preaching can be helpful. But then what happens on Monday morning? Anybody experience the Monday blues that pastors experience? You wake up Monday morning kind of foggy, a little lethargic, can't quite think clearly. What often is happening in that is a transient, mild, post-adrenaline depression. In other words, on Sunday, you've been cranking out all kinds of stress hormones all day long, not only for dealing with the difficult people, but also what's called eustress, E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S. The good pieces of ministry, the joys of ministry, physiologically are identical to the really difficult board meeting in terms of what it's stirring up in your body. And so we got to recover from that. And so on Monday, your body and your brain are trying to recover. Pastors often take Mondays off, so I would encourage you actually to reconsider that. This is a quick tip. My rationale here is that the church created your stress and fatigue so they can have you in the office on the day when you're not at your best. I think that's a fair trade-off, right? Take a day off later in the week when you actually can enjoy your day off and engage with something that is play for you and renewing to you, and see what kind of difference that makes. But this is what happens when we have chronic stress. There's an increase in pain because we have reduced endorphins, an increase in anxiety because of the reduced natural tranquilizers in the brain like serotonin and some of the other brain chemicals that have to do with mood and even depression. Increased risk for illness. How many of you ever have caught a cold or the flu right after Advent, Christmas, or Easter, Holy Week? There's a connection there with stress because you just cranked out a stressful season, which suppressed your immune system, which made you more vulnerable to whatever virus was going around that year, right? So we got to take care of ourselves. Increased fatigue and depression. What else do we know about pastors? I'm going to have to hurry here. The bottom line of what current research is showing, which replicates a lot of the research that's been done with pastors previously, is this, that pastors have a higher rate of what's called metabolic syndrome than the general population of the United States. And if you have 3 of these 5, you have metabolic syndrome. So if you have a large abdominal circumference for women over 31.5 inches, for men over 37 inches, which would imply moving toward obesity the way a physician would diagnose that. If you have high blood pressure, high triglycerides, which is the bad cholesterol, low HDL, which is the good cholesterol, and or high fasting blood sugar, which is connected to what? Diabetes. If you have 3 of those 5, you have metabolic syndrome, which predisposes you exponentially for cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, diabetes, arthritis, a bunch of bad stuff. Now, why is that the case for pastors? Well, we think it's because of this stress physiology business. You can see sort of the setup here. If I'm constantly taxing my stress hormones and I'm not exercising, the average pastor in America exercises once a month, probably not going to get it done, right? And I'm having people like force feed me their fried chicken at the church potluck every other day. Isn't it funny how people like feel validated if you eat their casserole, you know, like if you're the pastor. So people, they don't think about what am I doing to my pastor's arteries by feeding them this, you know. But a lot of church culture is around food. And in fact, I think one of the things we have to contend with is pastors are set up for what are called process addictions. And so let me just take a minute to chat about this while you're reading through that slide. We are a denomination that, since our inception, has been very sensitive to folks that are recovering from addiction, which is why we don't drink, because we care about the recovering alcoholic in our midst. And alcohol abuse, just nothing really good happens with that, right? And yet there are other things that can lead to a process addiction, which is to say becoming addicted to the brain's own internal chemical processes, the same way you would become addicted to alcohol or an external substance. And this is how pornography addiction works. It's not the pornography per se, it's the release of adrenaline and dopamine and other things in the brain that is what people become hooked on. We become hooked on our brain's own chemicals that are set in motion by a particular behavior. This is also how workaholism works. That's a tough one to think about in ministry. Because are you ever done? When have you ever done enough? Ministry's you even get rewarded for workaholism in ministry, right? Pats on the back for it. It's also how food addiction works. And part of me wonders, even in holiness circles, because we're so good at sort of abstaining from the substance abuse addictions, but maybe we haven't always used the same principle in our holiness theology to address the process addictions. You with me? Same principle, really. One of the worst things that we're contending with now are these. Every time you get a little text, a little like on Facebook, you get a little mini hit of adrenaline and dopamine in your brain. The average person in America right now is checking their phone 250 times a day. And there are going to be some implications for that. I actually experienced this last summer. We were on vacation, and for the first couple of days on vacation, I decided to unplug, kind of go off the grid. Have you ever done that? You know, I encourage all of you to do that regularly. I had this compulsion to check my phone, like for the first couple of days. I was like, wow, when did this develop? You know, where I like can't part company with my phone. And even though I wasn't expecting any important email or anything, I just like had this urge to check my phone. But it's the adrenaline and the dopamine that we get from that by doing that again and again and again. There's a whole class, I think, of technology-related addictive problems that we're going to be contending with. In fact, China, that is ahead of us technologically, so they have cell phones before we did and technology we don't have yet. They are seeing full-blown dementia in adolescents in China. Why? Because since birth, parents have allowed their children's brain to be overstimulated while the brain was still developing. And that has consequences. We're going to see increase in depression and anxiety and ADD and ADHD and all kinds of other things if we aren't careful to guard ourselves as adults, but especially up to age 25, the brain's still developing. And so to pace ourselves with that. And what this has done for pastors is it's just upped the ante with all the stress physiology. You thought you were available before 24/7, before these. But now you can get the passive-aggressive emails, right? The stuff nobody would have the courage to say face-to-face that they'll send in an email, you know what I'm talking about? At 12:30 at night, right before you go to sleep and you happen to glance at your phone and then you're ticked off and awake half the night because you saw that email. You know what I'm talking about? Got to have some boundaries with this stuff and pace ourselves. Okay. Let's see. What else do we know about stress and pastors? We've talked about most of this. Let's skip through for the sake of time. I want to talk about something just to lead into the next session, and then I'm going to end with, okay, here's what you can do about it. Here's some practical things that we know to take care of yourself by the time we're done here in about 10 minutes. Everybody with me? Okay. One of the stresses that ministry leaders, and really any kind of leader experience, but ministry leaders in particular, is criticism, and in particular what one research calls presumptive criticism, which is people presuming that they know better than you do what you should be doing and how you should be doing it, etc. And isn't it interesting, you know, if we need to have brain surgery, who do we go to? You go to the brain surgeon. Now, you may read up on WebMD before you go, but do you presume that you know more than the brain surgeon about brain surgery? And yet, people seem to assume that they are the expert theologian and you, pastor, are an idiot. And I'm being a little bit facetious, but you know the people I'm talking about. And to be on the receiving end of that all the time can be difficult. Now, let me give you a little rule, and this won't be in the slides. You can write this down. It's called the 70-30 rule, which is this, that 70% at least of the criticism you will receive as a ministry leader has absolutely nothing to do with you. Not a thing. It doesn't have to do with your leadership style, what you did or didn't do well, how you're similar or different than the last pastor. It has nothing to do with you. Now, that means a couple of other things. That means that 70% of the compliments we receive have nothing to do with us either. And I don't like to think about that side of it. It also means that 30% might be in the neighborhood of something that's fairly accurate in terms of where you need to grow or develop or be more aware. We all have those areas, right? And there are ways to navigate this that can be helpful to you. It's just helpful, first of all, to know that most of what's going to come your way doesn't have anything to do with you. And it can also often be delivered with cruelty. So what is that 70% is the question. And I would suggest to you that a lot of it is what a psychologist would call transference. It's transferring thoughts and feelings and behavior from past relationships or other relationships from another area in a person's life onto you as the pastor. The same way this projector is projecting this image onto the screen, you are the screen. Your role, your symbolic role, is the screen. And people are projecting all kinds of stuff onto you. Now, they're not doing this consciously most of the time. They don't know they're doing this. They're not doing it on purpose. They don't wake up on Sunday morning, say, I'm going to go to church and project onto my pastor all of my difficult stuff in life. But it can be unmet needs by their own parents when they were children, disappointments with life and with God, difficulties in their own marriage, displaced anger. In other words, frustrated as can be with something at another area of life, and you just happen to be a convenient target for that because you have to be nice because you're the pastor, so I can just go off on you, right? And you're not going to go off on me back. And so you are a lightning rod for transference. And there are several kinds that pastors tend to evoke the most. One of those we're going to talk about the next time we're together later today, which is erotic transference, which is exactly what you think of when I say the word erotic. There are people in your church, regardless of how attractive you think you are, there are people in their church that in their mind are going to sexualize the transference. And they're going to find you really attractive. Physically, emotionally, relationally. There's a certain kind of brokenness in people even that will intentionally try to seduce you. And intentionally try to cross your boundaries or invite you to cross boundaries with them. And so it's why we're going to emphasize in the next session together, what do healthy relational boundaries look like? Because you are set up to be swimming in a sea of transference. Now, therapists are trained in this. We're trained what it is, how to recognize it, how to even evoke it on purpose in therapy and interpret to help the person grow and become more aware. And often when long-term therapy is sort of done is when you've worked through the transference. But therapists also have the luxury of this nice 45-minute hour. They never see the person outside of that appointment, typically. They know the whole family history and where this is all coming from, right? You're flying blind, right? You don't know any of that unless you're around for a long time and get to know the person. So we'll make some suggestions to you in the next hour about boundaries and how to navigate that well, because you're going to be on the receiving end of a lot of stuff that doesn't have anything to do with you. Now, the helpful thing in that is that can help you depersonalize it, to realize it's less hurtful. It still hurts, but it's less hurtful when you realize this is really that person's stuff. This isn't mine to own. And there actually are loving ways, skillful ways to invite that person to own their own projections. And to help them see, really, this isn't about me. This maybe is about what you're bringing into this. But that presupposes that we know ourselves well enough to be able to distinguish the 70 from the legitimate 30%. You follow me? Which is why it's helpful to have self-awareness. Because I can more easily recognize what is the stuff people are projecting onto me, and then what is the legitimate stuff. I'll give you a quick example. A friend of mine, this is actually a story about Dick Pritchard, who's a person that Rebecca knows. And I was new on a pastoral staff with him. He's more experienced. A woman came up to him right after church, and it's always right after church, isn't it? And just started to go off on him, inappropriately, kind of nasty and mean. He was very non-anxious, stood and listened, and he said, well, thank you for caring enough to share that feedback. And I'm aware that part of what you're saying is actually not a strong suit of mine, and in fact, that's why I'm accountable to these 4 people. And I'm developing that part of my competency in myself. But I ask you to pray for me in that. The Lord's really helping me in that. But that's also why I delegate that to these people over here, because that's not what I'm strong in. And my jaw hit the floor. Totally non-defensive, non-anxious, almost completely. What can she say to that? Right? He owned it. Said, yeah, you're right. I'm not great at that. And that's why I've set up these structures to compensate for that. Then he was able to say to her, now, a lot of what you said, I actually am aware that's really not about me, and I wonder where that's coming from you. What's underneath that? What's behind that? And then they moved into a pastoral counseling conversation and a referral to therapy for her to go work on some of those issues that she was dealing with. And then we went to lunch, and he was fine. masterful. And I was just in awe of this. But he's self-aware, comfortable with who he is. And so you have to get to that place where you're able to navigate some of that. I'm going to skip ahead here. Want to mention one more thing, and then how you can take care of yourself. It used to be the case that psychologists thought that mental health and mental illness were on the same continuum. So on one end would be mental illness, on the other end would be mental health. But actually what we're finding is it's not the case. They're actually two separate continua that intersect in a grid like this. So you can have the absence of mental illness, and that's great, but you also need the presence of some things to equal mental health or flourishing. Does that make sense? And so, I don't know if this laser works. Yeah. So in this corner up here is flourishing, where you have high mental health and low mental illness. A lot of us live here, where we have some flourishing, but we also have a lot of stress and mental illness, and that's kind of what we see in pastors, is that one and the same time, poor physical health, depression is quite high for clergy, a lot of anxiety types of issues, but at the same time, we would say, I'm incredibly fulfilled and I wouldn't change this for anything in the world, right? So we want to keep that fulfillment side high, but address kind of this daily life strain piece. And I'm going to skip way ahead here, a bunch of slides. What we know that predicts the good stuff here is experiencing the presence of God in daily life far and away is the strongest predictor of flourishing ministry. Having a supportive congregation. The stuff that predicts the bad stuff is the demands and the criticism and the unpredictability we've been talking about. And then here in the middle, this is the stuff that tips the scale either way. And the biggest thing, again, is the social isolation. So I need you to hear me say this. You must have a place in your life, both if you're the pastor or the pastor's spouse, where you can just be a person. A place outside of your congregational family, where that person doesn't relate to you as pastor, so they're projecting onto you rather than relating to who you really are. You follow me? That's why it's isolating. Because most of the people in your life are relating to their own projections. They're not really relating to you. And so you have to have a place in your life where you can just be a person, where you can be ticked off and vent about that board member that you just can't stand, if you're really honest about it. You can laugh at a joke, you can play, you can be tired, you can be exhausted, not have to be on. You know what I mean? Find that friendship. Sometimes that's with another pastor in the area, and that's hugely important as well, but just find that somewhere in your life. It's going to be isolating. We can be proactive in preventing how isolating that can get. I got to skip way ahead here. Okay. So let me land the plane here. So what can you do for yourself? Cultivate Sabbath as a principle. It's so interesting to me that the ancient classic spiritual disciplines, there's so much wisdom to them that we're finding even from a neuropsychology point of view. Because what happens when you do meditation and prayer and solitude is you're calming down all that stress physiology that's been revved up by a life of ministry. And so taking time to have a regular rhythm of spiritual disciplines, even from a stress management perspective, and of course spiritually, is hugely important. Detachment. Taking a day off, and not just a break from the activity of ministry, but also a mental break. Because what we often do on that day off is we're ruminating about that sermon coming up, right? Or worried about that board meeting or phone call coming up. And when we're doing that, we're still churning up all that stress physiology. As opposed to engaging in an activity, what's called a niche activity, a hobby, something where you can totally lose yourself in the activity just for the sheer enjoyment of the activity, like a child at play. I have a friend who's a pastor who has model trains in his garage. And on his day off, he has a little engineer hat he puts on and everything. He's like 60 years old, too. It's great. He goes out in his garage and loses himself in his model trains. Doesn't think about anything really. He said, I can't tell you what that has done for me over the years, to just check out in a healthy way for a little bit. Take care of your body. You need 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night, regardless of who you are, the experts say. Nutrition is huge. Pay attention to that. Meet with a nutritionist, a dietary expert if you don't know how to get into a healthy lifestyle of eating right. and exercise at least 3 or 4 times a week. It can even be as simple as taking a 20-minute walk every day. 10,000 steps a day, you've heard that, is kind of the rule of thumb. Nowadays you can buy a Fitbit fairly inexpensively, put it on your wrist, and it'll tell you if you've got your 10,000 steps in that day or not. And it might not be next week when you feel the benefit of that, but 10 years from now, if you're doing 10,000 steps a day, you're going to be a very different place in your physical health. Embracing your limits around time management. Clarifying your role around your strengths. That's why we do emphasize strengths here. Because of the complexity of the job, leading with your strengths is hugely important. Managing your adrenaline. You have more conscious control over your adrenaline than you think you do. You can decide when you're in the midst of something that's stressing you out, how much am I going to allow myself to react to this? You have conscious control over that. Is this really a 5-alarm fire I should allow myself to go into full crisis mode or not? Do I even need to respond or react to this at all? Sometimes the answer is no. If we're not careful, because we always have that chronically elevated stress physiology, we will start reacting to everything as if it's the 5-alarm fire, when in fact, maybe most of it isn't. And so choosing to how much you will let yourself react to whatever crisis a person brings, whatever comes up in ministry, over time can have a huge effect. And then pay attention to certain kinds of relationships. We talked about family, importance of that. Congregational relationships, we're going to talk about boundaries in our next session together, conflict resolution skills, being assertive, having that personal friend outside of the church. And believe it or not, there is research that suggests, I think I mentioned this last night, it is good for your emotional and relational health to have a positive relationship with denominational leadership, with your DS, with other leaders on the district. Finding a mentor, and then a community of practice, some other pastors you can get together with on a regular basis and be real with, be vulnerable with, whether those are Nazarene pastors or not. Finding that community of practice can also be hugely impactful. A lot of information. Thank you for your attention. I've already kept you a little bit past time. Feel free to come up and ask us questions, and then Rebecca will take us through a session on healthy boundaries to think through this, the implications of this even more in our next time together. God bless you. Thank you very much.